Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our COVID-19 Town Hall Unanswered Questions live stream. My name is Holly Foxworth. I'm a registered nurse here with Axiom Medical, and I'm also joined by Chuck Cable, who's our Chief Legal and HR Officer, and then standing in for our Chief Medical Officer, which would be Dr. Scott Cherry, who is actually on location for a client. We have Angela Smith, who's one of our nurse client liaisons. So as most of you know, we started hosting a weekly COVID-19 webcast series several weeks ago that are related to workplace-specific topics. And so one of the things that we've noticed in all of this is that there's been a lot of questions that we have been unable to answer due to time. So we thought, what better way than to create a live stream and get some of that information to you. So before we start with those questions, I did want to go ahead and just take a moment to let our guests introduce themselves. Chuck, I'll start with you. Do you want to give us an introduction? Kind of give us a brief history?
Sure. For those of you that did not have a chance to listen in on the webinar last week, my name is Chuck Cable, as Holly said. I'm Chief Legal Officer. I'm also Head of Human Resources for Axiom Medical. I've been an attorney for about 20 years and have spent the better part of the past 10 years as the Senior Legal Executive and HR Executive for healthcare businesses here out of the Houston area, national businesses with kind of local headquarters. So I'm happy to be here and happy to answer questions.
Great. And how about you, Angela? Can you go ahead and give us an introduction as well?
Good morning. My name is Angela Smith, and I am a registered nurse. I've been an ER nurse for about 13 years. I've been here with Axiom for just under a year, and I'm super excited to try to step in and answer questions, although I'm certainly not trying to fill Dr. Cherry's shoes.
Those are indeed big shoes to fill, but we appreciate you joining us today. Well, the first question that we want to start with is related to temperature. Temperature has been a significant topic that continues to keep coming up in the broadcast that we've had. So I'll start first with you, Angela. We had one viewer that had asked, can you share with us how you define a fever and how often should a temperature be taken for an employee who's been exposed? Okay, so we define a temperature with anything 100.4, anything above 100.4. So if you have 100.5, that's considered a fever, or anything above that. We are recommending that if you have exposed employees at work, that you are checking their temperature at least twice a day. Just trying to be prepared in case symptoms do begin, that you catch them as early as possible. Great, thank you. And then Chuck, I'll go ahead and throw this one to you. Can you talk to us about pre-screening? And once you implement a pre-screening process, would that help with the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace? And then who should be included in that pre-screening process?
Yeah, I certainly think that what we have seen at Axiom and what businesses are experiencing across the country is a real need for essential services workers to have some process in place to ensure that that particular workforce is able to get to work safely and do the work they need to do. And so what we've kind of pioneered, I guess is the right word, with a lot of our clients is an approach where you do have kind of a daily check-in with each of these staff members to ensure that they're not currently exhibiting symptoms. Because if Dr. Cherry were on the line, one of the things that he always mentioned was, the testing is still very much in development and there's still a pretty significant error rate. And so what we do know is symptoms are a very good judge of when employers need to take steps to ensure that the rest of their workforce remains safe. And so typically what we'll see is a daily approach where either you've got kind of the ability to take temperatures on site before somebody kind of walks in, or at the very least, a process by which they are self kind of attesting to what their temperature is that day and whether they're exhibiting any other symptoms. That is a really good tool that employers can use to insulate their workforce. It also demonstrates the employer's commitment to that workforce and their health and safety. And it protects everybody else along the way, and it allows you to continue to do the business that you're doing and continue to generate revenue, which I think is a very critical thing for a lot of businesses right now.
Absolutely. And so would you say that this would be specific to one population, or would that be for throughout the entire organization that you would implement these pre-screening processes?
Really good question. And if you caught the webinar last week, one of the things that I feel pretty passionate about in terms of what businesses need to do going forward is they need to come up with infection control policies and standards that are going to go through essentially a process of identifying who's a low risk, who's a medium risk, who's a high risk in that relative work population, right? So for example, somebody who's a remote worker who works from home is going to be low risk. And so what you would ask them to do compared to what you would ask someone else to do that's working on site in a plant, at a rig, it's going to be very different. So from a kind of approach perspective, you do want to go through kind of this process of identifying different risk populations and adjusting what you're doing for that work population. Okay, easier said than done, I get it. But I think that taking the steps to come up with an approach, putting it on paper, is not just going to help today, it's going to help the next time you have any kind of an infectious disease that's impacting your business. And it can be applied across the entire organization. It can be applied locally if you've got a local kind of epidemic popping up. And it's going to be just a really good way for you to document approaches and processes that will absolutely be a really good way for you to address OSHA if they show up knocking on your door trying to accuse a given illness of being recordable. And there is precedent for this. OSHA just put out guidance, I think, on April 10th, indicating that COVID-19 is recordable under certain circumstances. And then there's also kind of some relief that OSHA is giving non-healthcare businesses as they go through and try to understand that environment. And I think there's some other questions that actually lead me into that. So I'll stop there.
Okay, perfect. And then Angela, I'll give you this one then. So expanding on that a little bit further then, give us an idea of additional symptoms besides fever that might indicate that someone should stay home.
Okay, so for sure, if they have a cough, whether it's productive or non-productive, if they're exhibiting any fever above that 100.4, shortness of breath or a hard time breathing, difficulty breathing, sore throat, headaches, muscle aches and joints, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, chills, night sweats, any of those types of symptoms. But the real important thing here is for us to make sure that we are changing the thought process of employees. So we want society to think more about when to go to work and not to. In the past, it was maybe looked down or negatively if you stayed home because you weren't feeling well. And under the new circumstances, you're exposing a lot of people that can negatively affect the workplace. So it's very important that we're changing our thought process and how we view symptoms and going to work while having symptoms.
Those are great points. And Chuck, you covered a lot of that last week whenever we went through that in the webinar. Is there anything that you want to expand upon, just kind of talking about how we're moving towards a different culture of introducing these things and really trying to preach wellness in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think, wearing my HR hat a little bit too, we want to take a holistic approach to this situation and figure out not just how we address with the immediate need, but what's the framework that we can implement that's going to ensure that we are all well positioned the next time any kind of an event like this occurs. And so just from a practical and pragmatic standpoint, changing the philosophy of how the business manages sick time, I think, is critically important, because that's essentially what we're talking about, right? It's just that the consequences of this event are much more severe. And so, historically, there's a ton of data out there that references, the U.S. loses in excess of 170 billion with a B dollars per year on sick days and expenses related to sick time. And so the one area that short of kind of, federally mandated leave and these other events that result in FMLA or ADA accommodation, that's kind of there's a whole service industry kind of built around that stuff. But what about the folks that are just getting sick? And do we know anything about how that's impacting the rest of your workforce in a given geography? And I think that this is shining a light, and it's an opportunity for all of us to take a step back to say, listen, it's not just about somebody calling in saying, I feel like crap, I'm not coming in today. We need to take a much more intentional approach to evaluating the kinds of diseases folks are bringing to the workplace and what we can do to mitigate the spread of those diseases, because we have this trailing annual impact of billions of dollars that's flowing out of businesses. So, it's ironic that this event is allowing us to focus on kind of the secondary benefit that is clearly material, but because sick leave is what it is, we've never taken kind of an intentional approach to change the way we think about it, right? Short of, you were out for a couple of days, I need a doctor's note. This is different. This is, let's take a page out of healthcare in terms of infection control, and let's think through not just how we execute on that from a kind of physical facility standpoint, but how do we demonstrate to our workforce that we care about them, we care about their health and safety, and when they're healthy, our business is healthy.
Great points. Great points. Well, Chuck, let's talk about legal. Let's move to your realm a little bit closer here, and talk to us about for employers that are looking to implement some of these pre-screening procedures. Are there any types of privacy issues or protected health information type of regulations that would prevent some of these temperature checks that are occurring at the workplace?
Yeah, great question. And privacy obviously is kind of a big rabbit hole for a lot of us to kind of dive down. I think from a practical standpoint, typically HR organizations are set up such that they routinely manage and store confidential medical information, right? What's interesting about the ways, occupational providers and departments operate, like Axiom, is we essentially become a repository for that employer-owned information. So what that essentially means is, when you think about the structure for this approach and the structure for any policies that become implemented, it's critically important to think through how you're onboarding staff. What consents are you getting on the front end? What consents do you not have that you may need that allows you to outsource portions of your OCMED or HR function to allow kind of these kinds of pre-screens happen if you're going to outsource? Or what consents do you need to do it internally, right? And so certainly you've got kind of state-based law on employee privacy, like unreasonable intrusion, false light, these kind of legal terms that relate to more general privacy notions. And then you've got these privacy concerns meant to prevent discrimination, right? So the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, is a really big one. And there are a lot of specific rules about medical examinations and medical inquiries, okay? My guidance on this is, and obviously I'm not your attorney, so please do talk to your attorneys about this, but from a general perspective, medical examinations and medical inquiries are allowed to occur on an ongoing basis so long as you're not discriminating, right? So you got to kind of do it for everybody. If there's a given risk group, like we talked about, you're going to have to do it for everybody. But again, so much of the risk that arises in these kinds of things can be really effectively managed by having a really good policy in place. That I cannot emphasize enough, and I'm going to beat the dead horse, right? You've got to have a policy in place that gives you the right to do this stuff. It sets the expectation with your employees. It's typically going to be either part of your handbook or part of that book of manuals and procedures they're obligated to follow. And you want to try to get consent on the front end, I think, also. But bottom line, yes, there's privacy risk. I think that's more related to how that information gets shared among the company, because you can get into a bad situation. For example, a company that shall remain nameless was asking Axiom to push specific employee-based health information to one of the operational VPs. That's a big no-no, right? Because it's evidence of discrimination. That's why HR has a very confidential kind of file they're supposed to keep that medical information in, right? So you want to have that barrier. There's all kinds of other federal legislation that can be implemented. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act is one. We talked about ADA. There's age discrimination issues if you've got folks with pre-existing conditions based on age. So really there's a whole lot of risk that can be at play here, but I really do think the way it gets managed is very simply communicating those expectations through a policy document, getting consent if you can at some point, either on the front end at onboarding or when the new policy comes into a place, and running that process, because there very clearly is justification from a business necessity standpoint to ensure that this workforce is safe from infectious disease. Because as I said last week in the webinar, workforce destruction is the risk we're talking about. That's everybody getting sick and nobody being able to work. And so it's critically important that we mitigate those risks.
Great. And so then along the same lines, then when it comes to the record keeping, is this something that should be done internally for whenever they implement some of these screening measures, or is this something that you would recommend that you would get the assistance of a third party? What's your thoughts there?
Look, I think that's another really good question. And historically, right, as I said, HR organizations were the ones that were set up to manage a lot of this confidential information, right? But I think the challenge is, as you think through how this issue is going to develop, and you think about the number of data points that are going to be involved in kind of a daily, weekly, a regular approach to kind of administering the safety and health of your workforce, that's a lot of data that's going to become exceedingly unruly very, very quickly. And so the thought there is quickly engage your HR teams to talk through kind of mechanisms and solutions that can be used to store the magnitude of that data. And to the extent this is going to be considered OSHA record, which we're going to talk about here, there's another question I think that we're going to get into that. But there's a long record keeping requirement for that stuff too. And so it's talking to your internal risk and legal folks as well about how that plays into your document retention policies and protocols. But the bottom line from my perspective is, I don't think there's a right or wrong way, but understand the magnitude of data points that are going to be flowing into your organization. It's going to be very different. And that volume, I think, is going to be much higher on a year-over-year basis.
Okay. Well, then we were talking about OSHA before, but there's been a tremendous interest in this topic of recordability. So what are your thoughts? If an employee did have to send, if an employer did have to send an employee home because they had a fever that was associated then with COVID-19, we've had a lot of people ask, is this what you would consider to be a recordable illness? What's your thoughts?
So another great question, and you got me. So another great question, and I think that OSHA put out guidance on this topic, I believe on April 10th, okay? And so what they're saying is COVID-19 is going to be recordable under certain circumstances. First, it has to be a confirmed case, and what they're using is the CDC's definition of what a confirmed case is, which is at least one positive test. Right or wrong, I don't know. Again, we've got these issues about accuracy of testing, but that's the stance that OSHA's taking. Secondly, the case has to be work-related. Let's talk about that in just a minute. And then thirdly, I'm going to look at my notes here to make sure I get it right. It has to involve one or more of the concepts that are encompassed in 29 CFR 1904.7, which is just the enabling regs of this stuff. And so the important thing for non-healthcare businesses right now, that second element of the case having to be work-related, OSHA's providing relief in that it's not going to be considered work-related unless there is objective evidence that that case was work-related, firstly. And then secondly, the evidence of that has to be reasonably available to the employer. Let's talk about that for a minute. So a lot of folks have been kind of righteously upset about this, saying, how the heck am I supposed to make this recordable when people are catching it at Walmart, at Target, like people are going out doing stuff and they're catching it who knows where, okay? That is absolutely a fair question. But the approach that OSHA is going to take is this objective evidence standard, okay? So how do you prove it? You're going to look at the people that person worked with. Were they within 6 feet? How many of those folks have tested positive? So it's essentially, right, it's like these coincidences, which by the way is what we call evidence if we're lawyers here, and we're going to try to look to see, look, if there's not if there's nothing else to suggest where the disease came from, other than the fact that we have somebody that tested positive and now all his coworkers in his little pod or his workspace are testing positive for it, that's going to be considered evidence that the employer had access to, right? And so OSHA is going to insist on recordability in that kind of a situation. Now, backing up for a minute, just because somebody has a fever doesn't mean that they're tested positive, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get tested, but it does speak to the fact that you need to have these good policies in place in terms of how you're going to manage these symptoms as they arise. And right now, states aren't testing everybody that has a fever or a headache, right? They're testing based on other confirmed exposures that then result in these symptoms, and then, okay, they're taking it more seriously. And then again, you go back to kind of this efficacy of the test to begin with. So I'm not saying there's not ample opportunity to challenge and kind of look at this from a different perspective, but OSHA's taken this temporary action to suggest that it is going to be recordable under specific circumstances. But one of those is objective evidence that they caught the disease at work. This, again, guys, going back to policy on sanitizing and cleaning, policy on infectious disease protocol, if you've got steps in place and you're forcing people to maintain those steps, and the person that's saying they caught it at work wasn't keeping to those steps, and you've got that objective evidence, guess what? You're getting yourselves a defense to that. So it's not just about taking care of the team, right? That should be a driving force as well. But practically, from a legal standpoint, your policies and procedures should also protect you. And so having that stuff in place and making sure everybody that's in that risk group is doing the same thing every day, it's going to provide a shield in the event that that person that's saying, I got sick at your place, it's your fault, my employer. If we know that that person did not follow the protocol for the day or any number of other factors that could be used as evidence, then there's also opportunity to kind of utilize that process and policy to protect. So there's, and by the way, right, by protecting yourselves as a business, I think you're also protecting the rest of your workforce too. So you're kind of getting that dual benefit. But that's OSHA's standpoint. So it's a little crazy, right? Because what we also know is that OSHA has said that colds, flus, that stuff's not work related, but they will very much take these temporary steps.
Great. Well, let's talk about return to work for a second. That one's been another hot topic. And Angela, I'll ask you this one. How long after a fever until the employee can return to work?
Well, the CDC guidelines at this point states that that an employee must be fever-free without the aid of a fever reducer for 72 hours, and they have to be 7 days past the beginning of their symptoms. And so that's what we're sticking to that as well.
And Chuck, would you feel like that there needs to be a specific policy related to that as well?
I think so the challenge with policies, right, is to ensure that they're drafted broadly enough to accomplish their fundamental purpose, but not become some crazy, 500-page document. And so I think that where my head lands on this stuff, and I'm actually working on some templated policies that could potentially fill this need because so many clients are asking about it. Where my head goes on this stuff is simply to say that in the event of either a pandemic or epidemic as designated by either state or federal healthcare authorities, that you would also default to whatever infection control policies, or procedures that are mandated on that emergency basis by the CDC, health department, et cetera. I mean, I think that's probably the best way, because what we can't do, we don't know if there's going to be another infectious disease like this. We don't know if it's going to be this one or if it's going to be something different. Maybe next time it's a crazy version of the flu, right? And so under general OSHA guidelines, for example, that's not recordable. There's not going to be a lot of focus on it. But at the same time, if it's a different variation that we've seen in the past, there's going to be all this extra guidance and suggestions and all that stuff. The key is to have a way to automatically kind of bake that into your approach to make sure that it's you can adapt as needed, depending upon the needs of your location or the country.
Right. Angela, I'll ask this one.
Before we
Go
go to the
ahead.
next question, I was just going to point out that if you have someone because we were talking about being in isolation per being exposed and things like that, we want to voice our opinion on that is that you can still work. You just have to adhere to the isolation. So if there's accommodations that your company can make so that you can continue to work, say work from home or other variations of that, that's still appropriate.
Those are great points. Yeah, especially that everybody is at home at this point, that prevents that from being an issue. Well, let's talk about some of these big terms that have come up in the media. We've heard all of these big things like asymptomatic super spreader and reactivation of the virus and a lot of these words that keep coming up, but they all seem to be traced back to this issue of, can someone still be contagious and infect others after they've recovered? So, Angela, do you want to take that and kind of give us some context there?
Well, as I was just saying about once you have symptoms, the CDC is stating that you be 72 hours fever-free and without using a fever reducer and 7 days post the beginning of symptoms. So right now, that's what they're saying, and we're adhering to that. But of course, everybody needs to understand that this is a new virus, and there's a lot of research going on, and these answers that we're asking, the information that we're getting is changing daily sometimes as they discover them. So right now, the CDC is stating that if you are following those guidelines, that you're fine to go back to work. But that could change upon their research developments.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, we do see it changing significantly. Well, let's talk about exposure then, and maybe some social distancing questions that have came through. And Chuck, I'll ask this one of you. What is the recommended distance and time limitations when it comes to contact that can't be avoided?
Such an interesting question, and I don't have a ton of expertise on this, so I'll probably defer to Angela for some of it. But another, I'm going to go off track just for a minute on this, Holly. I think that there's a lot of really interesting technology developments that are occurring related to social distancing. And so I believe the CDC's guidance is at least 6 feet apart from each other to maintain the appropriate kind of boundary. Again, as Angela just said, there's still so much to be learned about how the virus spreads. That may change over time. But right now, that's the standard. And one of the really interesting things that I read about the other day was Ford Motor Company has their workers in factories wearing a device that essentially will start buzzing if they get within 6 feet of each other. So what a really interesting way to begin to utilize technology and kind of geofencing and all these really neat technologies to kind of have folks be like, oh, okay, that's how you know, right? You're not going to walk around with a tape measure or rope saying, here, let's measure this out. So this is a really interesting solution they came up with to manage what is in practice, I think, a really tough thing to do. 6 feet is about like this, but they were able to accomplish it through technology. And I think that there are going to be a ton of opportunities more broadly to ensure that this kind of distancing, work areas, sanitization, like all these other things, there's a lot we can do. Daily health attestations from employees that are supported by that objective evidence that we're getting from wearable devices, for example. Some really cool developments that I think we're going to see help that. But all I can really comment on is the CDC's recommended 6 feet. Angela, I'll defer to you on the rest.
In addition to the 6 feet, they are specifying that you have to be within 6 feet, for 15 minutes or longer for the exposure level.
Yeah, for it to kind of be flagged. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay. Well, you had talked about some of this briefly before, Chuck, but this question was one that we had gotten on multiple occasions. But they were asking about the subject of substantiating a workplace exposure, and so it looks like their questions may be asked about how it can be proved that someone got this at work versus in the general public.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this was the question I was thinking about. It's circumstantial evidence, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. If you've got somebody that tested positive, and the only other people on your crew are the guys that all work, or gals that all worked within X number of feet of that employee, and that's the only group that's tested positive, that's going to be considered the objective evidence that OSHA is going to look to accuse you or to accuse this particular infection as being work-related. Again, there's a lot of defensive mechanisms that businesses can put in place, right? So yes, but we have an infection control policy, and that person that tested positive didn't do A, B, C, and D under our policy. Therefore, we're not responsible for it, right? And so you can challenge under those circumstances. I think what's really interesting from an epidemic or pandemic control perspective, as local health departments kind of become engaged and you have to kind of start to report these cases, if all of these corresponding big box retailers, essential service providers generally, if they've all got similar procedures in place, and we're creating this kind of world where it's not just people that work there, but it's people that are coming in the door that have to go through some rudimentary, attestation to shop, for example, then it becomes much clearer because we can start to correlate the infection between different, potential hotspots. Again, that's future facing. Maybe it happens. We have to wait and see. But from a purely practical standpoint, it's going to be getting into somebody's business a little bit, right? And saying, listen, you're testing positive and you're asserting it's because you caught it while you were at work. Well, where'd you go the week before, the 2 weeks before? Who did you see? Who did you visit with? You're essentially going to go through contact tracing as well to try to argue that. So I think that it's scary to have OSHA say that COVID-19 is going to be recordable under certain circumstances. But again, let's dig in. Let's understand what evidence is required to substantiate that. I think healthcare businesses, it's business as usual for them, and they're still going to be stuck through whatever processes they're going to have to implement because they've got this track record of infectious disease control. For non-healthcare businesses, again, the risk here is not just kind of this being recordable, guys, right? The risk is, to what extent is OSHA going to say, you know what? We've talked about implementing infection control standards before and other services that are not healthcare. We haven't done it. It's time to do it. The way we can potentially get away from that world, because I feel like you don't want Big Brother telling you what you have to do and when you have to do it, right? The way we can challenge that is by implementing our own processes and demonstrate that they're working. And that's going to make OSHA say, you know what, you guys are doing a good job. We're not going to get involved. There's track record of experience to suggest that's the approach they'll take if the right approach is taken by business to mitigate risk.
Good points. One last thing that we wanted to cover here was mask and facial covering. So I'll give the first question to you, Chuck, and then I'll put the last one to Angela. The first one being that we know that the CDC has recommended some of these facial coverings. So should employers simply encourage the use or actually require that? And would that be based on the different types of employee classifications?
Yes, I think it should be based on classifications, but it should be based on risk classifications, right? So I think OSHA also put out another document talking about guidance of how to manage COVID-19 in the workplace. And by the way, they mentioned infectious disease control plans. I'm just saying in that document, but they also, again, speak to kind of stratifying workforce into these different risk categories, okay? And so what I would recommend is if you're thinking about providing masks, you should think through the risk categories and to the extent you've got different risk categories, like people that are working from home, for example, I don't see a need there as long as you've got effective remote work policies and folks know what their expectations are. And even in that case, right, the likelihood of catching it based on a work issue is very, very slim. It's folks that are going to the store to work, going to the plant to work, right? So when you talk about risk categories, it's like, okay, are these folks going to be forced to work within 6 feet? It's you look to OSHA's PPE standard, right? Like facial. I don't have the label on the tip of my tongue right now, but you look to OSHA too to say, listen, if you have administrative safeguards you can put in place or some other way to mitigate the risk as a business and you're comfortable with it, you've got your OCMED partners kind of chiming in saying that's good enough, then maybe you don't have to have masks for everybody. But certainly CDC guidance is going to be very influential in how you think about that. And in some circumstances, it may be adverse evidence used against you to the extent you choose to go against it. So, I do think, again, going back to the policy approach, stratifying your employees into the levels of risk and then making decisions about who needs masks and who doesn't based on that is a much more methodical way to think through how to mitigate that risk.
Okay. And then, Angela, maybe you can help us out with this one. We'd had somebody that had asked, would face shields be an acceptable substitute for actual face masks in situations where social distancing is not an option?
I would think not. And I will tell you why it's not. A face shield does cover the face, but there's no closure to it. So it's open over the front of your face. And when that person sneezes or coughs, or someone around them sneezes or coughs, there's an avenue for those droplet particles and airborne particles to still get to your mucous membranes. And so the reason that they are saying like the surgical type mask or a face covering, even a bandana or the fabric mask that so many people are making, those are closed, so they're tied to your face and they don't really allow space for the airborne and droplets to get around it.
Great. Is there anything that you wanted to expand upon that, Chuck?
I don't think so. I trust Angela's expertise in this area. I think it's rational also, just from a non kind of clinical guy. Face shield, face mask, very different. Doesn't make a lot of sense to use those interchangeably in my mind.
Hey, I did want to just ask you about something that had came up in the last webinar. You brought it up, and I thought it was a great point. You'd made the reference to that there had been a recent suit that was filed. I believe it was with Walmart, but they were talking about protecting employees. Could you maybe just kind of go through that with us here?
Yeah, I mean, I think risk is an interesting topic relative to coronavirus and COVID-19, and when you think about kind of how risk can present itself to a business. Everybody kind of thinks about lawsuits, but you don't put a whole lot of emphasis on it unless and until it happens. I think that the Walmart case, we're gonna have to wait and see what happens with that. And I do expect more of those to happen. Plaintiff lawyers are going to use this as an opportunity to, create a potential new area in the law in terms of businesses' inability to adequately protect their employees from infectious disease. I think that you're going to ask questions about it, right? Like, okay, what about work comp, exclusive remedy? There are ways around exclusive remedy. And right now, one of those pretty consistently is an intentional tort or intentional negligence. So I think that there's still a framework in place that's going to be challenging for a lot of these cases. But as I thought about it, there's an employment-related risk too, to the extent that a worker feels so unsafe that they feel they have no choice but to quit. Is that a constructive discharge? I don't know. Is it a hostile work environment? I don't know. What I do know is that, lawyers on that side of the fence can be very creative, and they will rightfully explore every opportunity to represent their clients zealously in obtaining relief for whatever wrong has occurred to them from their perspective, right? So from a pure litigation risk perspective, there's going to be some developments here. It may be a little while until we really see the risk that gets kind of created as a result of these cases. But it's something to keep an eye on, and it's something to talk to your outside counsel about and get a perspective on, what you can do today to mitigate those risks. my personal opinion for the 20th time today is, come up with an infection control policy that's in place for everything, not just pandemic disease, right? I mean, it's all fine and good for like these cybersecurity, disaster, preparedness, breach mitigation. Like when something really bad happens, here's what we're going to do. Business continuity planning. But this is infectious disease protocols. I think do have application day to day, season to season, and it's something that businesses should consider because I feel like you have to put some work into it at the front end to come up with the structure. I think once the structure's in place and you're left to execute on it, I feel like it's manageable and the cost is going to be very worth the benefit that businesses will receive in the long run. I kind of went off track there, but I think that that risk on the lawsuit side is going to be really interesting to see how it develops. Likewise on OSHA with this kind of recordability issue and where they're going to go with it. They talked about objective evidence now, but again, we don't know what that means until it starts to get interpreted in the context of an argument in a fight. So we'll see.
Great points. Well, thank you both for taking the time. Do either of you have anything else that you want to share before we wrap up? Angela, maybe you first.
Not specifically. I just think that it's a great time for you to pull together as a company and work together for the benefit of the employees in the company. We all have to take precautions that we weren't prepared to do, and everybody has. Most of the clients that we work with, they're all working together, employees and employers, and it's working out, and we're doing what we need to do.
Great. How about you, Chuck? Any closing statements you want to make?
Sure. Thanks again, everybody, for observing or listening in today. I think one other thing I wanted to mention, I mentioned it last week. So I did write a white paper on this concept of infection control and return to work processes. I think we're going to publish that early this week. So please be on the lookout for that. And I'm happy to kind of entertain any questions or comments that arise from that. I'm sure you can coordinate with Holly or whomever at our marketing team to do that. And I'm looking forward to participating in some future webinars.
You guys are both great. Thank you so much. Well, and just a reminder, we do have our weekly COVID-19 webcasts that are going to be coming. So this Thursday at 1:00 p.m. Central, we're actually going to have our president and CEO, Mark Robinson, and then also joining him will be our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Scott Cherry. And so if you haven't already registered, be sure and sign up for that, and we'll see you Thursday. Stay safe.